Wife and Daughter Save His Life by S.C. Turnbo. In recalling incidents of the Civil War times, Jim Thomas, an old-time resident of Greene County, Missouri, tells of his father's experience with a band of men one day during the war while he lived 4 miles northeast of Springfield. "At the time I speak of," said Mr. Thomas, "the Confederates were in possession of Springfield. One night before they gave up the city, 2 mounted men come to Father's house, and Father gave them supper and fed their horses. Though the 2 men made no threats, we supposed they were spies from a band of robbers sent to find out where we had any property worth their while or trouble to come and take. My father owned a fine stallion and 2 good mares, which were kept up in the woods in the care of my brother, Bill Thomas, to prevent them from being stolen. My brother was careful not to bring them home when the main roads were frequently traveled with the war parties, some of which were regular Confederate soldiers, and some were marauders, thieves, and robbers of all kinds. On the following day, after the 2 men had visited our house that night, we saw 30 horsemen advancing slowly toward the house. Now, they did not appear to be in a hurry, and when the head of the column reached the yard gate, the leader halted the men and called for my father, who was in the house, and he made no attempt to get away. Now, Father went into the yard, and the leader asked him where his stallion and 2 mares were, which Father flatly refused to tell him. The leader did not interrogate him any more, but ordered 5 of the men to dismount and take charge of him. And while they were dismounting and hitching their horses, the leader ordered the tall, slim fellow of the band to take a rope from one of the saddles and fix a running noose. This was rough language, for it indicated something dark, and my father knew what it meant but said nothing. My stepmother, whose name was Liddy, and my sister, whose name is Celia Ann, and myself prepared for the worst, for we were convinced that there were enough men to overpower and murder every one of us. My father was standing in the yard in front of the door, and the leader ordered the men to put the rope around Father's neck and swing him up in the air. And if they let him down in time, he might change his mind and tell where the horses were. When the men took hold of him to place the noose around his neck, he resisted. But there were so many of them they soon overpowered him, and resistance was useless, and he stood still. At this juncture, my stepmother and sister, both of which were nearly frightened nearly to death, rushed up to my father and tried to push the men away, but finding that they could not do this, they grabbed hold of the rope and tried to snatch it from the men's hands. But their strength was too weak against so many stout men. They changed their tactics, and while the robbers made efforts to place the noose around Father's neck, the 2 women jerked the rope away. Once in a while the men would get the noose almost over his head, when with a dexterous lift the women would raise it up in spite of the attempts of the ruffians to fasten it around his neck. The more they worked to hang Father, the harder the women struggled to prevent it. I was only a boy, but I well remember how myself and stepmother and sister begged and implored the thieves not to hang him. It was a stirring and sorrowful scene. All the family, except Father, was crying, and he did not seem to be a bit afraid. It seemed at one time they would succeed in getting the noose in the right place, and they would drag him to a tree and throw the loose end of the rope over a limb and pull him up. But the 2 brave women foiled them in their murderous work. Finally, the men desisted, for it seemed like the firm resistance made by my stepmother and sister baffled them, and they asked Father if he would go to Springfield with them, and he answered in the affirmative. To this, stepmother and sister stoutly protested against his going off with them, for they believed it was only a pretense to get Father away from the house so they could shoot or hang him, and Father started to the yard gate to go with them. We all pleaded with them so hard not to take him off that after they had started off with him a short distance, they turned him loose and rode on. and he came back to the house. It was now that our grief turned to shouting and rejoicing. We were so glad that his life was saved, and my father did not remain at home any more until after the Southern men had given up possession of Springfield.